Any of you know what this is? You know?
That wasn't my plan, but yes.
That was a bad throw, but a good catch on your part. Thank you very much for playing along. This is just to kick us off. My name is Matthias Duwe. I'm head of climate at the Ecologic Institute in Berlin. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight to our side event on transatlantic perspectives on carbon markets and linking emissions trading system. Here at the first UNFCCC negotiating session following the adoption of the Paris Agreement. There's still, you can see the roll of the wave of enthusiasm is still rolling through the room at that mention. I have the pleasure of moderating the event this evening, and I had to, of course, introduce this gimmick up front because this is going to be the means through which we will have access to not a roaming, but literally a flying microphone for the discussion part of the event. So be prepared. If you put up your hands, you'll have something flying towards you soon thereafter. But before we get to the discussion part, just a little bit of context on the event and on the speakers who have agreed to join us tonight to share their expertise with us. So first of all, this event is organized jointly by Ecologic Institute and Climate Strategies, and we're very grateful for the cooperation and our colleagues from Climate Strategies that are in the room. And additional material is available from this excellent network of climate policy experts also outside on the display table. And Ecologic Institute also needs to mention that we are organizing this event and this conversation as part of a project for which we've accepted graciously funding from the European Commission and their External Action Service and from the Bosch Foundation, among others, that we organize jointly with the Atlantic Council, an esteemed partner from the other side of the Atlantic. And that's where that transatlantic perspective comes into play, because that project that I'm talking about is called ELEAP. It's the Emerging Leaders in Environment and Energy Policy. And that is a network that we have brought together over the last couple of years between the EU and North America, largely the United States, of young professionals, youngish professionals in some cases, that work extensively on energy and climate issues in particular, and that get to exchange as part of the network and have grown their relationships and share expertise on an ongoing basis and at side events and also in study tours. So that has a little bit of background, and I can use that as a segue to introduce our two speakers, because the first one of them, Aki Kachi, who's International Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch, is sort of a well-known colleague of ours and collaborators, including as, in fact, a fellow of our ELEAP program for 2015-2016. Thank you so much, Aki, for agreeing to join us. He's also got an extensive background in emissions trading and emissions trading system from around the world, having worked for many years with Adelphi, a similar institute to Ecologic Institute based in Berlin, but they're serving also the Secretariat of the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP, which many of you will know is a governmental association that is trying to build bridges on emissions trading system and support the adoption of similar systems around the world. And so his input to our conversation is going to be, though, on the international dimension of carbon pricing, on what is in the Paris Agreement in particular to the future of carbon markets. And that perspective will be complemented by our dear friend and colleague Michael Mening, who is currently Executive Director at the Center for Energy Environmental Policy Research at MIT, and a former director of, in fact, Ecologic Institute in the US, our Washington sister offices. Thank you very much, Michael, for coming to speak. And his presentation will be focusing on the US side of the equation, and in particular, sort of the ongoing developments on carbon pricing in the US. So without further ado, I would like to Aki to get us started. And I should note, as they're switching presentations, that this event not only has the wonderful gimmick of the flying microphone, but it is also being recorded. Our dear colleagues at the UNFCCC will be able to tell you if you need to know what they're doing with the recording. Hopefully, it will lead to, of course, further dissemination of the contents being discussed here. It's part of a bit of a trial period, I understand. So, Aki, you have the floor.
Yeah, on my behalf, I'd like to thank you for the invitation, and on behalf of eLeap, I would like to invite everyone who might be interested to apply to the program. It's a great program. You meet many very interesting people coming from a lot of issues from many different perspectives. It's a worthwhile thing to think about. A brief word on Carbon Market Watch. We may be infamously or famously known as previously CDM Watch. So there's quite a reputation built up around that. And a few years ago, we've expanded the focus of our work from CDM Watch, the CDM, to carbon markets more generally, including the EU ETS. We have a big focus on that. We're based in Brussels, but we're also engaged in various other aspects, including the ICAO process. We hope to be also following the IMO process when that eventually gets going. A very, very quick sort of review of where we stand. Of course, we had the Kyoto mechanisms, international emissions trading, joint implementation, which was sort of finished up recently, and the clean development mechanism. And then underneath the UNFCCC, we had a framework for various approaches, a new market mechanism, and non-markets. And we sort of have something similar now under the Paris Agreement, cooperative approaches, a mechanism. There's quite a bit of disagreement about what we should call the mechanism. I'm going to shorten it to the Sustainable Development Mechanism, as is common in NGO circles here, mostly. And then there's a framework for non-market approaches, which I think also has actually implications for transatlantic links, although it's not the first thing that we would think of. I think it's also important to mention and keep in mind that these various mechanisms are all parts of different processes in the UNFCCC. The Kyoto Protocol's mechanisms do not have any clear standing under the Paris Agreement. JI, obviously, we've wrapped up, as I mentioned. But they belong to the Kyoto Protocol, whereas the Paris Agreement is a separate body. And it remains to be seen to what extent the Paris parties will want to adapt or adopt or bring the experiences or various aspects of the previous mechanisms into the new agreement. And it's sort of a question where we're going to go with these processes for the FEA, the NMM, and non-market mechanisms. André Marcoux has pointed quite a bit to the chapeau, what he calls the chapeau of Article 6. And I think it's quite interesting that he does it that way. In the SAMSTA meetings these past few days, I think there were over 9 hours of meetings, there's not much attention paid to the 6.1, the chapeau, as André Marcoux calls it. But I think it's interesting to see that we can have kind of an overall frame for international cooperation within the article. And I think it also influences how we should see the various other paragraphs in the article. So what people automatically almost think is going to be the most obvious route to linking emissions trading schemes is, of course, cooperative approaches. Various countries, parties interpret it differently. It's going to be a very interesting process about how parties decide to interpret it. In the past few days, we've mostly been talking about if we should be having submissions and workshops, or submissions and technical papers and workshops, or how that process is going to go forward in Marrakesh. And we see a lot of the previous sort of divisions, I think, from before Paris re-emerging. And also it's going to be an interesting experience to look at how the old discussions around framework for various approaches, the new market mechanism, find themselves again in the elaboration of the various articles. I'm not going to spend too much time on these, because I think a lot of people here have been following a lot of the discussions quite closely. I expect most of you have read the Paris Agreement, I would hope.
I'm sure they have. They all have personal copies in their bags, I assume.
Yeah, by heart. And then we have what I'm going to shorten to as the SDM. And it has adopted a number of characteristics of the CDM. To some extent, there's a question about how much more of a role sustainable development and co-benefits are going to play. I heard South Africa put quite an emphasis on that this morning. But it's clear from the language that there's going to be, or the intention is that there will be public sector participation and private sector participation. There's sort of vague language to what extent the host country will be counting part of the reductions from the SDM towards its goals and how much of it will be traded. But there's also a mention of overall mitigation. I think different parties have different interpretations of that, but many NGOs were very happy to see what they saw as a net mitigation element in that, and the share of proceeds, which we also have in the CDM. And this is relevant to linking emissions trading schemes in that it's a bit of an indirect link. Michael Mailing has done a lot of work on this as well. One could say that there was an indirect link between New Zealand and the EU ETS through the mutual recognition of the CDM and JI as offsets in their system. And even though Japan doesn't have a emissions trading system or a cap and trade system, through the acquisition of that, Japan and other parties, of course, participated in that. So there's sort of a price interplay to various extents. I mean, they're all different sizes. Although I was interested to hear that New Zealand said that they were very proud to be providing demand for the international market. Other people put more emphasis on the expectation that neither the EU nor the US nor China will be using international markets, at least in the short term, towards their INDCs. But basically, for the relevance to linking emissions trading schemes, this is relevant through that indirect link aspect. And there's a lot of discussion on what non-market approaches are. For me, I think this is quite interesting in the context of linking emissions trading schemes, partly referencing a lot of work that was done by Dallas Bertraw at Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C., where he has this concept of linking by degrees, where there's kind of a rapprochement between two different systems if they start sort of aligning their design features, that there are benefits to be realized even if there are no actual units transferred in between, that there's sort of not only administrative benefits but various other benefits. So I think it's also relevant to say that although it's very vague what non-market approaches and a framework for them might be, even if there were no transfers in between possibly a robust clean power plan, cap and trade, and the EU, or between California and Quebec and RGGI and the EU, partly through the International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP, there is kind of a discussion and exchange on those different design features that one could interpret as a kind of a link. And I wanted to plug in also, of course, our Carbon Market Watch's comment on what linking could provide to systems. And in the chapeau of Article 6, we talk about how a voluntary cooperation can allow for higher ambition. This is something that we would have liked to have seen in the linking directive in the EU ETS. I was told recently it was in there in the beginning. It was taken out eventually. But Carbon Market Watch would like to see an automatic increase in ambition anytime that we start thinking about linking. If we're really going to have a gain in efficiency through lower costs, there should be also a clear increase in ambition corresponding to that. And when thinking about that, sort of as an evaluation of a prospective linking partner, obviously jurisdictions will have to think about how ambitious their potential partner is. ICAO and international aviation is a major sticking point and has been in the past and may become that in the future again as the EU reviews its stop the clock policy after the ICAO assembly meeting this fall. Exclusion of international offsets. At the moment, both the EU and the US have both said that they won't be using international offsets for their INDCs. To what extent international offsets are exactly the same as foreign allowances in your system is sort of something to be explored, something to think about. One major issue that I think is maybe one of the, major challenges for linking emissions trading systems around the world is very different approaches to price management. The auction floor price in California is very, very different in design to the market stability reserve in Europe. The UK has already imposed a floor price that works in a very different way than the auction floor price and works in a different way from the market stability reserve. You also have a recent announcement from France that they will also push a minimum floor price for French entities. This is sort of a delinking of these countries from the more general system. Although pending Brexit, I expect the EU ETS to continue in most EU countries. But it's a major point of contention and a major issue of sovereignty, to what extent these countries are going to allow a foreign country or a foreign economic integration entity to have a say about something that's very tightly linked to industrial policy, to energy. It's a major challenge. And robust allowance allocation. This is one of the major critiques that we have had of the EU ETS. There's been far too many allowances distributed. Now fewer to the electricity sector, but it continues, especially in Eastern Europe. That's something that a similar price needs to fall and be felt by different sectors of the economy to actually have an effect. And of course, very important for civil society, we had a hearing in the European Parliament on linking, specifically having to do with the EU ETS and linking with Switzerland. Many members of the European Parliament felt that they were getting more information from Switzerland than from the European Commission. There was a major complaint. Civil society feels that there's not been much transparency in the linking discussions. That's something that is a major ask for us in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Aki. So you've given us a sort of a brief overview over the new animals, mechanisms, different hybrids that are to come out of Paris, which are still sort of whose shape coming out of the mist post-Paris is not, I think, quite clearly delineated at this point in time. We'll have a chance to explore what that means for linking and for sort of post-Paris global carbon market developments in a short while, and you've given us some insights on your perspective on linking. But before we get to that broader conversation, I would like for Michael to give us a little bit of background as somebody who's been making the journey crisscrossing the big pond, sort of a lot also in terms of emissions trading as a mission, and of course his background and his exchanges have led him to many other parts of the world that have, in particular in recent years, been thinking about then developing and deploying emissions trading systems, such as in the likes of Korea and China. But your home base now is the United States, and this is what you will sort of focus on and giving us your take on the transatlantic perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. Is this microphone working? I think it is, no? I'm assuming there's no chance I can stand up. I would wander out of, or can I? Go ahead. Is that okay? Wonderful.
And you don't need to walk around with this. You'll.
Well, see, I have the old-fashioned thing. That's much cooler. So thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Climate Strategies, Ecologic, for inviting me. Thank you, Aki, for having the pleasure to co-speak with you in your new role. And I'm looking forward to hearing sort of the positions. I'm by no means a missionary for emissions trading, as perhaps Matthias maybe let it seem, and becoming increasingly critical, I think, about some of the flaws of the mechanism that are embedded in its, let's say, in its vulnerability to political economy in every single case where we see it being implemented, and so radically departing from the theoretical strengths of the instrument. And so increasingly my interest is more in the political economy of the instrument. But I will try to keep to not missionizing neither for nor against, and give you sort of, or try to make a bit of sense of what's happening in the United States and how that might relate to linkages with the European Union. And I'm getting up so that I have a chance to use the laser, and I'll make sure to aim high enough. So maybe very briefly, a reminder that emissions trading as an instrument is actually a North American idea. You could argue that Ronald Coase sort of already foresaw some of the conceptual underpinnings, but it was really a Toronto-based economist, John H. Dales at the University of Toronto, who really put it in a book in 1969. And his whole motivation was, why couldn't the environmentalists in industry finally sort of come to an agreement on something that they can do and end the needless debate that they always have, never being able to meet sort of in the middle? This instrument might achieve that. But it was very much still focused on non-greenhouse gas emissions. There was criteria pollutants, the traditional air pollutants, also water pollution, et cetera, that he used it for. But you did see, not too long after that, a bit over a decade later, the first attempt to introduce trading in an environmental policy in the United States, with a phase out of leaded gasoline, which proved to work relatively okay. More importantly then, the implementation of the acid rain program under the Clean Air Act for sulfur dioxide emissions, which many consider to have been very successful, even though there too you could see a few things that worked better than, and a few things that didn't work so well. And then later on even for nitrous oxide. Interestingly, the US had a moment where it might have gone full steam into pricing as opposed to quantity rationing. So with a tax rather than an emissions trading system for climate policy in 1993, but that attempt to introduce a broad energy tax in the US tanked. And even nowadays, when anybody proposes a tax and it tanks, they say, oh, it was BTU'd, in reference to the spectacular failure of President Clinton's initiative in his first term as president. Of course, we all know that the United States signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, so it theoretically became, a party. It was on track to becoming a party to a international legal agreement that does have market-based instruments, and Aki mentioned them. But by withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol, it exited that system of flexibility mechanisms. Partly in reaction to the lack of action at the federal level, you soon after had a number of states on the East Coast and Mid-Atlantic proposing a regional initiative, which became known as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. They signed a memorandum of understanding, which essentially was geared to leading towards a regional system for trading of emission allowances for the power sector. In 2007, shortly before the end of the second term of President George W. Bush, you had a very important Supreme Court decision that essentially mandated the EPA with regulating greenhouse gas emissions from mobile and stationary sources under the Clean Air Act. So that changed the discussion quite dramatically, and of course also the expectation of a change in presidency. On the West Coast, you had different initiatives merging, different regional initiatives becoming the Western Climate Initiative, which also had in mind sort of to set up some sort of trading system, again at a regional level. By 2009, you had the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast actually trading. Still 10 states then. Now we've lost one, New Jersey, but it's still 9 states, and they're trading quite actively. 2010, an attempt to create, now with the new administration of Barack Obama, and majorities, Democratic majorities in both chambers of Congress, there was this spectacular, this real sort of opportunity to pass a landmark act of legislation that, among other things, would have introduced economy-wide cap and trade. It's known as the Waxman-Markey Act for that bill, which passed the House of Representatives relatively narrowly, but it did pass in 2009. The problem is it also has to have a complementary bill passing the Senate in the US legislative process, and it never got out of committee in the Senate. There simply was, by that time in 2010, no way that you could have the majority needed to get to a vote on the merits, so a 60% majority. So that died, and so that essentially drew attention back to the regional initiatives, but also that which Massachusetts versus EPA opened the door to, namely regulation, not through legislation, but under existing legislation under the Clean Air Act. By 2013, you also had trading starting on the West Coast, California and Quebec, with a slight delay. And by 2014, those two systems linked, which is perhaps the best example of a pure bilateral link between two separate jurisdictions, two separate trading systems, albeit trading systems that emerged within one overarching system design that was created under the Western Climate Initiative. And just last year, in August, the final rule on the Clean Power Plan was issued, and it was published in the Federal Register in October 2015. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So if we look at sort of carbon trading, so emissions trading for greenhouse gases, not for other pollutants, you had this thing that Canada, of course, ratified the Kyoto Protocol, so it theoretically was entitled to participate in the flexibility mechanisms, a top-down market-based approach with the CDMJI and international emissions trading. The US withdrew, so it itself sort of barred itself from participating in those mechanisms. At the same time, subnationally, by 2009, you had the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative starting. By 2013, you have 2 additional jurisdictions, California and Quebec, participating under the WCI in trading. And now, if we jump a little bit forward, this is what the landscape could look like in 2 years. So by then, Canada is at least, it has mentioned the intention to explore market-based instruments in its INDC as a way to comply with its nationally determined contribution. We know that Ontario and Manitoba have both very credible plans. They're in fact in the middle of creating the legislation that would lead to subnational trading, so province-level trading, to link with Quebec and California under the Western Climate Initiative. In the United States, even though it's not mentioned in the INDC as a means of compliance, obviously the Clean Power Plan is in full steam, although right now kind of stalled. But that, of course, creates opportunities for trading, and I'll talk a bit about that. Mexico mentioned trading or market-based instruments as an instrument, compliance instrument, in its INDC. And in Latin America, you have a few jurisdictions that equally mention trading in their INDC. So the picture, even though it's by no means complete and a lot of uncertainty still resting here, it could eventually become dark and darker red, if you like, if we look at this particular map. A few remarks on the Clean Power Plan, and this is really, well, why even bother now that the Supreme Court just recently stayed implementation of the Clean Power Plan? There's a high chance that whatever happens after the Federal Court of Appeals and the DC Circuit decides on the merits of the Clean Power Plan sometime in September, most likely, that it will go back to, well, it either will be appealed if the decision, either side, those that are suing against the Clean Power Plan or those that are suing, want to uphold in the EPA, of course, would appeal to the Supreme Court depending on the outcome. And then we will have a decision in the Supreme Court. So this is likely to take a few years. But at the end of this, even if we have an administration, say with President Trump, who has already announced that they would reconsider, possibly repeal the Clean Power Plan, a whole new rulemaking has to be done to repeal it. So this, for now at least, is the closest indication of what we might have at the federal level for stationary emissions from the power sector in the United States. And that's why it's worth still talking about it, even though there's a huge amount of uncertainty about whether or not it will enter into force, when, and with what final design elements. But the whole idea behind the Clean Power Plan is this is sort of a complement to a separate rulemaking on new and significantly modified sources. But of course, most of the emissions in the US are coming from electric generating units, existing electric generating units in the power sector. So this is the big one, if you like. Transport, the corporate average fuel economy standards have also been very important in the overall sort of achievement or reduction of US emissions. But this is sort of the biggest single contributor, existing electric generating units. And the aim is to achieve a reduction of roughly 1/3 of emissions by 2030 from existing power plants. That deadline, of course, now is somewhat up in the air. The way it works is that each state is given a rate-based and a mass-based mitigation target. A rate-based target means a certain level or standard expressed in pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour generated, but it also receives a budget, a mass-based budget, which is essentially an absolute figure of overall, short tons of emissions. And these are calculated for each state based on 3 pillars. What the EPA sort of thought was realistic in terms of increasing the heat rate of steam-generating power plants, so steam-based power plants, especially coal, shifting or redispatching from coal generation to natural gas, especially natural gas combined cycle plants, and finally, increasing electricity generation from zero-emitting sources, which, to Europeans at least controversially to some extent, includes nuclear, but of course also renewable energy. Now it has been and it continues to be a court drama. Of course, it all started with a court case. As soon as it had entered into force, and there had been lawsuits already brought against the Clean Power Plan, even in the previous proposal stage, but the same day that it was published, a coalition of states, 25 states, plus 2 other separate states, plus a number of energy utilities and trade associations all filed suits against the Clean Power Plan before the only court that has jurisdiction over these issues, namely the US Court of Appeals and the DC Circuit. You probably followed the news, so in February 2016, you had the Supreme Court merely voting to stay implementation of the Clean Power Plan, so essentially putting it on hold until a decision by the DC Circuit on the merits, on the substance, has been adopted. And that was extremely unusual because the Supreme Court has not done that in the past for stayed implementation until substantive merits had been assessed by the inferior court. But ironically, one of the main voices, many interpreted this decision as sort of really the Supreme Court, which in 2007 still was at least a majority in favor of regulating greenhouse gases, may have changed the majority position. It's a very political thing, and you have these 9 justices, and you try to sort of read everybody's, their past decision history, etc., which president nominated them, etc. So it becomes a very partisan issue, even in the court where it shouldn't be partisan. But anyway, one of the most partisan, you could argue, justices passed away just 4 days after voting to stay the Clean Power Plan. So now we have a vacant seat on the Supreme Court. We don't know whether President Obama can still appoint a judge that would likely be more left-leaning, more favorable to the Supreme Court, or whether this will have to absolutely wait, which is, again, sort of unheard of, until we have the next administration, and what sort of judge might be appointed then. And finally, just a few days ago, we had another surprise when the Federal Court of Appeals decided to forgo what would normally be a three-judge panel decision, and instead push the whole decision to September. All the judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals in the D.C. Circuit will be hearing the merits of the case. Very briefly, I don't want to go into too much detail, especially since this is to some extent still speculative, but the Clean Power Plan, again, as I mentioned, sets performance rates and mass-based emission budgets for each state. And at the same time as the final rulemaking was published, the EPA also issued a federal plan, a proposed federal plan, and a proposed model trading rule. In fact, it was 4 different sort of options that were outlined in that. So there are proposals for a rate-based and a mass-based federal plan. This is what comes into effect if a state does not submit its state implementation plan by the compliance deadline, which used to be 2016 and can be extended until 2018. And it also additionally includes a model trading rule, again with the option of rate-based trading and mass-based trading. What's the difference? So mass-based trading is what you would identify immediately as emissions trading. That's what you have in the EU, that's what you have in RGGI, that's what you have in the Western Climate Initiative. Absolute caps on emissions, allowances reflecting the level of the cap, distributed among compliance entities, and thereafter they can trade. So this is really relatively straightforward. And a few details, the EPA would operate a nationwide registry, entities would be allowed to bank. The allocation of allowances would be up to each individual state, but for states that do not submit their own state compliance or implementation plans, the federal plan would set out some recommendations, it's not clear what. And the alternative would be rate-based trading, where instead you have a baseline and credit approach. So an entity that stays exactly within the subcategory emission standards, so NGCC, a natural gas combined cycle plant, would have a more ambitious benchmark than, say, a coal-fired generation plant. If they overachieve those rates that are set out in the state implementation plan, then they can generate emission rate credits. So a little bit like, say, a CER under the CDM. There's some similarity conceptually there. And each ERC, however, wouldn't represent a ton of CO2 avoided, but rather 1 megawatt hour, a zero carbon megawatt hour. So that's sort of the basic, and there's many different options that come from that. So depending on whether a state, does its own implementation plan or the federal implementation plan is adopted, and depending on whether the EPA will choose to go with a rate-based or a mass-based trading in its sort of overarching federal approach. What does this mean for linking? I'll accelerate because I'm pretty sure that So for linking,
just
one
over
thing.
the 15 minutes.
Thanks. For linking, for one thing, the recent joint statement of Prime Minister Trudeau and Barack Obama just a few months ago was quite interesting in how much space it afforded to carbon markets. Right in the 4th paragraph, I think, it mentions them quite prominently and also mentions the importance of fostering, subnational initiatives, fostering cooperation and learning. And in other parts of the joint statement, it also mentions Mexico and cooperating with Mexico. So you could even sort of envision that there's some sensitivity or some mind to eventually explore cooperation with Mexico. Also not so long ago, the Vice President for Energy Union here in the EU, Maroš Šefčovič, had this sort of ambitious idea that, the EU wants to explore linking trading systems with all sorts of pretty much everybody who's working on trading, including several North American jurisdictions. The thing is, this is not a new idea. If you look exactly 10 years back, you have similar statements. Governor Schwarzenegger saying, California will create a market with the EU. Our then foreign minister, oh, how history repeats itself, saying, we will have this mächtige transatlantische Kohlenstoffmarkt, so a powerful market across the Atlantic. And we haven't, of course, achieved that, and there's reasons for that. I'll try to sort of mention very briefly a few of those, but let's maybe just focus on an archetypal, the epitome of a straightforward link, two jurisdictions, direct link, very similar systems, virtually identical systems, similar units, etc. And that's what's happening under the WCI. So if an entity in California typically sells to Quebec because that's where the excess or where more supply is available and more lower marginal abatement cost opportunities, then you would account for that under the WCI tracking system, so the joint registry that they have. Now, of course, if we do get a national clean power plan in place, you would have to the extent that there will have to be some sort of aligning those systems to make sure that any trades that occurred with foreign entities like here, Quebec, would also have to be reflected in how California is complying with its state budget, for instance, under the Clean Power Plan, and similarly with other links, domestic links. And it's not entirely clear yet how the Clean Power Plan would be overlaid or even absorb existing subnational trading systems in the US. And now with the Paris Agreement, of course, you add yet another layer, the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So you there too have to account for these transfers, but in this case between sovereign national jurisdictions. And that would also potentially include, for instance, the EU, which has a bubble, which creates a bubble under the Paris Agreement, so it could count as one single entity. And so this is sort of illustrates a little bit, I think, the difficulties, and again, just very briefly, if you look at the different INDCs, but even if you just look at the Clean Power Plan and the different options it sets out, the rate-based versus mass-based, you have different targets, different nature, different types of targets, different units, there's ERCs versus short tons. In the EU, we have metric tons, so yet another unit. And again, you could also imagine in states under the Clean Power Plan, but of course, nations under the Paris Agreement have also been placing all kinds of additional mitigation activities. And these too could theoretically count as ITMOs and be transferred if you had some way of extracting or calculating the mitigation value that they represent. Say, for instance, with renewable energy, green certificates, with energy efficiency, white certificates, and so on and so forth. So it's getting increasingly complex. There's two sort of main, I'd say, strands of how this happened. So far, we focused on ensuring that linked systems are compatible before they link and stay compatible going forward. But increasingly, if we have this heterogeneity, we may have to start thinking, that's what happened under the WCI or RGGI. You just designed the whole system from the beginning in a harmonized way to facilitate linking. But as we have very different designs for market-based instruments, even within jurisdictions and certainly in different regions. And you could imagine, also spheres of influence extending from the large ones like the Chinese, the EU one, etc. We might get these clusters that are quite different in design. And certainly the Californian design is very different from the EU design. You start thinking about ways, can we go from compatibility to comparability? Not just between trading systems, but also vis-a-vis other policies like renewable energy standards and others. And that's something the World Bank has been exploring. I think it's relatively problematic and politically rather, say, ambitious at least, but an idea where you would have independent rating agencies giving sort of assigning mitigation value to different types of mitigation efforts. All right, sorry for being over time, but...
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. I very much appreciate that you both basically gave us an outlook on kind of what is probably the next Netflix original series. The CO2 law or House of Emissions or whatever it's going to be. But we hope that, as with all good TV entertainment, it's going to go on for quite a while, but then end up with a happy ending, right? But you also, I think, gave us an outlook on the difficulties in terms of a world that doesn't look quite as neat in terms of its options for linking as the textbook would have it. And so this is going to give us plenty of fodder for some conversation. I I have my own questions, but I'm going to put those aside. The first one, though, while I'm asking you all to just raise your hands if you do want to come in on the conversation now, the first one actually is going to be Aki, who also raised your hand. So this is a prerogative for the panel to continue with a follow-up question, but anyone who wants to come into the conversation, start putting up your hands now so that I can see them and can get you into the queue.
Just very quickly, Michael, I was interested to see that you didn't mention either the US INDC target nor the EU target. Given that the US has a range and not an absolute target, what kind of challenge does that pose to linking, number one? Number two, how much of the US INDC target do you see being fulfilled by the Clean Power Plan? And my impression is that regardless of what happens in the Supreme Court, the Clean Power Plan was not that much beyond business as usual, given various patchworks of climate policies on the state level and renewable energy technology getting cheaper all the time, and more strict other laws on other pollutants. How much hot air is already in the Clean Power Plan? My impression is that it's not beyond business as usual.
May I first have ask for that box and then say the candidate has 30 seconds to answer for each of the two questions.
Oh, okay, thank you. I think there were three even. So the first question, so that sort of illustrates the difficulties you will have with all these different types of targets. So you have, of course, intensity targets based on GDP, based on business as usual, based on efficiency per, say, unit of production or electricity generation in different jurisdictions. Regarding the US specifically, of course, remember that there's no trading system across the economy, whereas the Clean Power Plan itself, at least, that does have a discrete 32% target. The question, though, is, can it be expressed in absolute terms, or is it a breathing cap, if you like, depending on how much, for instance, there are ways in which you can game the equation of pounds per megawatt hour if it remains rate-based, where you could theoretically have emissions grow, and yet because there's so much more electricity produced, but very efficiently, you would still be complying with the rate. So that could be problematic. In terms of how much it would contribute, the pure arithmetic should be somewhere between 45 and I'd say around 45%, given what share of US emissions the power sector contributes and how much they are to reduce relative to the 26 to 28% range economy-wide. That's something that a CGE modeler could probably give you very well. I'm sure the EPA has run the numbers. And the final thing, is it just business as usual, formed into rulemaking? Again, you'd have to do this as a full-time job to understand all the implications for each of the 50 states. I know my colleagues in the joint program on the science and policy of global change, they've done a state-by-state modeling effort, an integrated assessment model where they calculate by state. And it really is not a homogeneous picture. So some states, you can absolutely argue that it's a very easy thing to achieve. They don't, they essentially are just following the dynamic that you have that's market-driven, shifting to gas, et cetera. And it protects, for instance, politically, states were shifting away from coal is politically very controversial. It protects them to some extent. But other states, for instance, it will be quite difficult to achieve. So there we projected abatement cost of up to $1,000 per ton of CO2 avoided unless there's trading that makes it cheaper. Sorry.
Excellent. Well, it sounds with $1,000 per ton, there's definitely an incentive for some form of linking, whether that's intra-US or external. In order for me to start practicing my throwing skills with the three hands that I saw earlier, I'm going to start in the first or second row, if that's okay. And kindly introduce yourself by name and affiliation.
Hi, hi Michael and Aki. Thank you for the really interesting presentations. My name is Stephanie. I'm doing research at Cambridge University, and I'm focusing specifically on hot air, particularly in Article 6. And I think you mentioned it briefly as well in your question, Aki. And this is, I think, a question mostly to you, Michael, on the very practical linking aspect. What do you see could be the role of UNFCCC in linking international carbon markets, and specifically on the environmental integrity of units being traded, and on risks of hot air where we have inflated NDCs and caps for emission trading schemes?
Do it. Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was, you get to start off with the easy questions, but we'll collect, I suggest. And it was you there in the back.
Thanks very much. It's good to get my skill set worked on here. Colin O'Hare, I'm the acting head of delegation for Ireland. I'm very interested in the ETS and its evolution in Europe, but I'm curious about to what extent the Clean Air Act, whatever it's called, has impacted on the appetite to go beyond energy-based emissions, and whether there is any evolution on, for example, the industry-based emissions or transport-based emissions, and whether as well there's the evolution of phase 4 in Europe is being closely watched in terms of the evolution of policy in America. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I know I have one more up front, but I'm going to come a little closer, right? So I'm just worried that I'm going to ditch it.
Hi, I'm Sabina. I'm from the University of Bayreuth, and I study global change ecology. And actually, I think some of the other questions covered some of the things I wanted to know. But if you could just explain a little bit more about the difference between the mass and the rate-based pathways, and which stakeholders prefer which pathway. Since you did take a political economy approach to it, and which one is actually more robust in terms of maintaining environmental integrity?
Another easy question, and so I will actually take the fourth one up here so that we don't have too much of a delay. Oops.
That was much of a catch. My name is May, and I'm from the National Climate Change Secretariat in Singapore. I enjoyed both presentations very much. I was just wondering if you could enlighten me. I especially like that slide on the multiple kinds of markets. So there is, of course, there are regional markets which might be linked. So, for instance, between Quebec and California. Then, of course, there might be national markets which might link to other things at other points. And then there's also potentially markets for ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. Given that all these markets are being layered upon each other, do you think all this linking that's taking place is helping or hindering the accountability process between countries? And how do you think we can sort of reconcile all that's going on? I mean, in terms of from a accounting as well as environmental integrity sort of perspective. The other question I wanted to ask was in regard to the couple of regional markets that you saw. There was a North American one, South American one, a Eurasian one, and an Asian one. It seems to be a geological or geographical basis for that. I was wondering if you really see markets developing along like those geographical sort of based on geographical proximity, and truly is it just easier to link because, I don't know, maybe it's easier to travel to each other's countries and hang out and talk about things? Or do you think there could be other kinds of groupings taking place? And if that was just one representation of how you thought things could play out? So those are just two questions that I had. And I'm going to try and prove myself with a throw.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I would actually recommend to the two of you that rather than just going one after another, that we deal with these questions where there were some interlinkages topic-wise, that we deal with the UNFCCC linking set first. That was sort of Stephanie's question, the first part of May's, I think, and then to the more US-American related ones after. That's okay. So I would actually suggest, Michael, you start first briefly on those. No, we've had you talking for too long, haven't we? Aki, it's definitely Aki's turn. You go first on the global issues, and then we move over to Michael.
About the hot air and what the UNFCCC what role the UNFCCC can play. I mean, the INDCs are nationally determined. So if a country wants to give themselves hot air, there's not that much we can do about it. We can say, you're giving yourself hot air. NGOs are doing that. I'd like to see other parties doing that a bit more as well. I think there is a bit of a lesson in the experience in Doha, where we went from the first Kyoto commitment period to the second commitment period, and there was a discussion on how much of that hot air could be taken over or carried over. I think that could be very instructive to provide a kind of a baseline for also linking. If I'm thinking about linking myself to another system, what is the reference point to what is ambitious or what is not? That's hard, but I think that experience in Doha, where we went from the first commitment period to the second commitment period and put some restrictions, not enough, but some restrictions on what could be carried over, is very instructive. There is, I mean, obviously economists will tell you that ideally we would have one carbon market for the whole world, and it would be the most efficient thing, and climate change would be solved, and it's beautiful. The political economists will tell you it's not realistic. There's a lot of people talking about linking. We had a couple of quotes in Michael's presentation, but the only real links that we actually see in practicality are between California and Quebec. I would argue that's it's a link, but the systems were developed together from the get-go. And we have a linking agreement between the EU and Switzerland. It hasn't been implemented yet. It's also pending various other somewhat political economy, maybe political unrelated issues, where there will be a referendum in Switzerland about fundamental bilateral relations between the EU and the ES, between the EU and Switzerland.
Don't forget the EU's best member state, Norway, though, and its connection.
So we have a lot of people talking about linking. The World Bank is working very diligently about thinking about this. I don't actually see it. I think we see more and more that countries are recognizing that there is a major self-interest in decarbonizing themselves. And I think there's a lot of work being done on the benefits of imposing a carbon price, even a high carbon price on oneself, and buying emissions reductions from elsewhere. You're losing those benefits for yourself in terms of the co-benefits. You're also potentially having large financial flows out of your system. And I think it's very controversial when we have all of these leakage provisions to say, on one hand, we're going to give away free allowances so that to protect our industry. On the other hand, we're paying some other country to decarbonize, and we're investing in their decarbonization, and we're making their industry more competitive. So I think the benefits, I think we're starting to rethink the benefits of linking, and there are not that many countries that are actually linking. There are a lot of them talking about it, but I'm a bit more skeptical of this global carbon market future.
Thank you. Michael.
All right, thanks. Just adding very briefly on the first question, hot air. You know, I think the UNFCCC can realistically exert a very constructive influence on ensuring the integrity of transfers of transactions in terms of avoiding double counting and setting out rules on that. I don't think it will have, just as all the substantive mitigation efforts are set out in the non-binding, domestically driven, you know, nationally determined contributions, that is where you have the hot air coming out of. And I don't think the UNFCCC, after everything we've seen in the last few years, will, or the, you know, the universal negotiating process would have any power over. You could see it then rather in the iterative, stock taking and review process. That's a different thing. That's not trading specific. So industry, funny, good question. When in 2005 the Northeast states, Mid-Atlantic states were discussing RGGI, of course they were looking at what's going on in Europe. They even had delegations come over and tell them about the mishaps, the windfall profits, etc. It's interesting. They went with auctioning right away. Some of their conceptual auctioning work on how do you conceptualize an auction, what are the design options, influenced in return California, and then again the EU, some of its cost containment. So there's been nice learning going on. But one thing that from the beginning they pretty much knew they couldn't try would be covering industry. Now, you do have industry covered in WCI, California and Quebec. In Quebec, it wouldn't have made sense to cover the power sector only because they only have like 1% of their power through fossil fuel generation. The rest is hydro. California is a bit more mixed, but that reflects, I think, the dichotomy you have across North America and especially and the United States. In Canada, you could see similar things. Alberta would be very, very different minded as opposed to, say, the Western and Eastern neighbors that are much more progressive. In the US, you have similar dynamics, more resource dependent, coal, etc. dependent states would be much more against any kind of ambitious, of course, regulation, but B, where you have heavy manufacturing industry, for instance, you'll have similar competitiveness concerns, unions, etc., all pushing back. And so I don't think that there's much hope. And the few discussions there have been about, for instance, linking WCI and RGGI quickly stalled, partly because of the different scope and coverage of the systems. So it's very much a matter of competitiveness narratives, which we have here in Europe as well. Then the question about the different layers, I think you addressed that. And then the geographic proximity is a good question as well. Oh, and I have the political economy one still. So interestingly, when you look at emerging cooperation between trading systems, look at Europe, for instance, and you do have the EU ETS expanding to the EEA countries, so Norway, Liechtenstein. In Iceland, early on, you have the EU quite influential, of course expanding, EU expansion itself was a major. You have the EU fairly influential in the Kazakh trading system, the development of that one. There's been many attempts for the EU to influence the Chinese pilot systems and now also the national trading system, but China is a big actor and they sort of take, I think they, Craig could speak to this, but I think the mentality there is if they have interesting technical advice, we'll listen to it, but they certainly won't determine our political decisions, that's our decision. Whereas I could easily see just by the strength and the dynamics of the larger market, making it attractive for very small jurisdictions like, say, Singapore, where you might have very little liquidity, you have fewer, low-cost abatement options. To link to a larger system like a Chinese national system, that's sort of a natural dynamic you would envision. In North America, a little bit similar. The Californians are talking with a Mexican province and a Brazilian state about cooperating on offsets. Of course, Canada and the US, we've had the link there. But that's not, nonetheless, that doesn't mean that that's the only way it can emerge. There are reasons why it's maybe easier, but then one of the biggest links you would have seen would have been between Australia and Europe, and that's about as far apart as it can be. You could argue that the economies and the political systems are similar, but still, you don't need geographic proximity. But it seems to make a few things easier. So that's why that speculative map of how they could evolve, say, in 10, 20, 30 years has this sort of geographic approach. Then finally, the question about rate-based versus mass-based and what's the political economy there. Well, there's people here in the room like Michael Gillenwater who probably breathe this on a daily basis and can answer it much, much better, so you might want to ask him afterwards. My sense is that the incentives there, or the game theoretical dynamics, if you like, are such that if a state, has, for instance, anticipation of continuing to grow, and also grow its electricity demand, they will, of course, be more interested in a race approach because that allows further growth of electricity generation. All you have to make sure is that that generation is as efficient or more efficient than a benchmark. Whereas states that see stagnating power demand and otherwise are maybe more progressive in their climate policy aspirations, would probably be more amenable to having a mass-based approach. One thing, though, mass-based does make it generally much easier in terms of administrative implementation to have trading across jurisdictions, subnational jurisdictions. So there is sort of that carrot, at least, that all of the states would have. And of course, if the EPA proposes a federal plan that includes mass-based trading, that would also further push the mass-based approach. But that's about as far as I can try to interpret the dynamics there.
Thank you very much indeed to both of you. We have time for another round of comments and questions. So I'm looking at the room, and you are welcome to raise your hands. In the meantime, I get to fire off one of the questions that I was interested in hearing your opinions on. You were both in this last round relatively pessimistic, or rather maybe say realistic, about the concrete linking options in the near future between systems, considering what the political economies are, how different the systems are, and how many of the plans that are currently underway aren't at the level of linking readiness that you would require, I would say. So, but going back to the beginning of and the early slides of Aki's presentations, what's emerging now in terms of the new systems coming out of, for the Paris Agreement era, what is your sense of their likely evolution? And in that regard, I'd like to recall in part the development of the CDM, which was to a large part driven in terms of a market and demand for the credits by the EU Emissions Trading System. And the demise of the CDM is in part due to the fact that demand faltered, basically. So, where do you see potential demand for credits and collaborations under these new mechanisms? Is there anything potentially comparable to demand creation by the EU ETS, or might this be one of the possible big stumbling blocks for this system going forward? I took enough time to expand on that question, so that I hope one or two of you have thought of other questions. You shouldn't be afraid by the fact that I'm threatening to throw this thing. I'm happy to pass it on in person also. No immediate, so excellent. Thank you very much for being straightforward. I hear you have to go another question.
Okay, so the next question would be, going back to the geographical points that were raised, would you say that there's a race to develop maybe a carbon trading system now? Because there are some theories with just general trading in the economy, like economic trading, that the trading partners that capture the largest amount of goods and services, they can actually set the agenda for the others who are late coming into the trading partnerships or trading relations worldwide. So would you see something similar happening, where maybe Asia is trying to really quickly develop their carbon trading system, and then in an effort to kind of set the base for other countries who are slower in the process?
Thank you very much for that question. And as I'm moving over to the two of you to say, let's take really just a few minutes to address these last comments, and then I promise that everyone who sticks with us to the end obviously is warmly invited to the finger food and drinks that we have waiting outside. We all are very much aware of the fact that it's been a long day for everybody, and we thank you all for your attention, your participation up front. But you still have two questions, both of you. Who would like to give us the first shot? Okay. I think it's Mr. Kachi is first. Okay. It is so decided.
Yeah. So I mentioned that according to their INDCs, the EU, the US, and China, the largest emitters in the world, also will not be sources of demand. There is some hope among some that the EU will increase its ambition and do that not internally but externally. We would like to see primarily an increase in ambition internally in Europe. The countries, AIDA came up with a big spreadsheet of who they think, in their interpretation of these countries' INDCs, who might use markets. There are not that many of them. You have Switzerland, Liechtenstein, major source of demand, Liechtenstein. And New Zealand. New Zealand, okay, that's also not the biggest country, not the biggest emitter in the world. I think the major prospective source of demand that we see right now is ICAO. And although I would very much like to see Boeing and Airbus competing to be developing the next super low emitting airplane to be going around the world, unfortunately, most people expect aviation emissions to continue to grow significantly over the next few years. There's not enough ambition to reduce emissions in that sector. There are debates about how much that is possible, but basically we can look to see a source of demand coming from ICAO, possibly eventually from the IMO, and I think it's very important to look to what kind of credits shipping and aviation will want to be buying. I don't see the accounting provisions in the Paris Agreement dealing or specifically addressing that. And most of the accounting is between parties to the UNFCCC. Obviously, aviation and maritime emissions are not parties. I think it's kind of a hole that we need to fill. But if that's done well, they could be a source of demand. A very brief comment on the race to develop an ETS. I think it's very interesting to see that it was important for California and Quebec to link at the time that they did. They both, I mean, their systems were developed together at a time where there was a bit of a vacuum in terms of climate policy on the US national level and on the Canadian national level. And I think they were quite aware that if they move forward, they will set the agenda for how other states approach it. And I think that's been validated in the approaches that Ontario and perhaps Manitoba are taking. And there is something to say that that if I can lead on decarbonization, then I can export my low carbon technology to the rest of the world. So I think there is definitely also a race, not necessarily to develop an ETS, but definitely benefits to being more ambitious oneself.
Thank you. And Michael, famous last words.
Well, so I think, in the near term and even medium term, I think you're spot on that aviation might be the only source of real demand for commoditized abatement, if you like, in form of credits. But of course, we've become a little bit cynical that we're getting used to this world in which any carbon pricing system has prices between $5 and $10, and there's a few outliers, but so like Sweden with 123 and so on. But that's not supposed to be the long-term picture. And as we move beyond 10, 20, 30% carbonization to 50, 60, eventually 80 to 95, in fact, net neutrality, carbon neutrality, we are by default looking at relatively pricey abatement options at that point, say process emissions from cement, chemical industry, etc. These are not things that you can just sort of do at $5 a ton. It's pretty much impossible. And we might say, well, look at how solar and in the energy landscape, how the cost of zero carbon energy has fallen. Well, remember the policies to do that were actually quite costly. We don't talk about them much because there weren't an explicit carbon price, but the feed-in tariff in Germany, if you calculate how much it cost, say, 10 years ago through feed-in tariffs to reduce a ton of CO2, it was in the hundreds of euros. And we were willing to tolerate that. This is purely a static perspective. Dynamic efficiency of the feed-in tariff in Germany, I think, is phenomenal. The world now has access, thanks in part to the German and other developed nations implementing costly policies, access to low cost, low carbon energy. So there's no question that was useful. But again, we shouldn't sort of get used to this idea that any carbon pricing system will only have allowances at $5, $10. Eventually it will rise. The social cost of carbon estimates range between somewhere $30 to $120, something it has to be much, much higher. That's really where the price of carbon should be. And if it is there, then we will see demand, because not only do we now have all developed economies reaching for yet more and more ambitious targets, which are supposed to be revised and strengthened over time. But we also have many of those countries that had no targets at all having some form of mitigation effort. So, you could see, in an economist's world at least, that really the time for carbon markets is yet to begin. But there are ifs, for sure, absolutely. Very briefly on the question of domestic. So, a race to the top of carbon pricing, I fear my experience looking at the development of emissions trading systems around the world has been, the Quebec and California example is a rare oddity. I think that by and large, you just have such gruesome domestic battles to fight in getting an emissions trading or any carbon pricing regime through the legislature, through the political system. The linking, etc., is nice for rhetoric, but and deploying and perhaps even influencing neighbors to start deploying their carbon trading system. But the reality is, it's a huge battlefield in your domestic political arena, and so it rarely, this is just sort of a nice to have, but it's not the primary battlefield. And that's why I'm not really too optimistic that you will have countries so gung-ho going forward. The EU is a bit of an exception to that rule, and there's even been academic studies on how the EU has missionized its EU ETS around the world, how much money it has poured into that, et cetera, et cetera. But again, even in the EU, I would think that the missionizing has perhaps gotten a little bit quieter in recent years. So, long answer for short questions.
Well, so, you really sort of managed very well to have us end on a bit of a somber note with regard to carbon pricing. But I think it reflects sort of experience and your assessment of sort of the current state of affairs. And I really appreciated also having the long-term, which is not quite as long-term anymore, perspective on the picture changing with much bigger emission reduction cuts that are essentially sort of having to come within the next 10 to 20 years. And the picture could very well change in that regard. I want to thank first and foremost every one of you again for attending, participating, for your questions, for your time and your energy, brain-wise, and sort of on the chairs. I also want to thank technically the people who have made this possible, my dear colleague Andreas and the staff at UNFCCC here. I want to, of course, thank both of you for prepping and giving your thought and experience into the room. And then thank the sponsors sort of that have made the project work possible, including, of course, our dear colleagues from Climate Strategies, and then the funders of ELEAP, the European External Action Service, and the Bosch Foundation. And just as a very last plug, for those of you indeed sort of living, working on either side of the Atlantic, the next round of applications for being part of a one-year stint in the ELEAP program are coming up soon. And the roster of the network is not quite as male-dominated as this panel was. I can promise you that. So apologies on that front. That network is sort of is very refreshing. Is up sort of into their eyes and eyeballs and ears into policy discussions. And so we welcome new faces and brains for that network anytime. Thank you very much, everybody, and please join us for a quick drink and a nibble and continued conversation. Thank you.